A large part of this YouTube channel is my attempt to try to figure out what the crisis that's going to play out over the next few decades will look like. I think almost everyone in the world intuitively knows that something bad is going to happen, and those who don't are either boomers or they're coping. We've all seen the world progressively get worse. As a historian, I've tried to explain from studying the historic record what this might look like in abstract politically or socially. For a speedrun, I think we'll experience what historian Peter Turchin calls a secular crisis, with the last few examples being the French Revolution, the wars of religion in the 1600s, and the Black Death. These are driven by extremely complicated demographic factors that push societies towards civil and international wars, plagues, and social collapse. They've happened consistently roughly every 200 to 300 years since the dawn of civilization. This is compounded by the issues Peter Zeihan talks about, in that almost every country in the developed world will see its population go down by half over the next 60 years due to low birth rate, as well as the third world can't feed itself due to complicated supply chains that aren't tenable. I cover all of this in my video on the crisis of the 21st century, and if you want more detail, I've made about a dozen videos about other aspects of it. I'm not even talking about climate change or nuclear war that are completely tenable big crises. I'm covering more the sort of things your ancestors would have had to deal with in hard times like plague, war, or famine. However, the difference between reading about a crisis happening in history and actually having to live in it is the whole world. There's a Chinese curse that goes, "May you live in interesting times," and our era proves that. Somehow my day job is being an internet historian, but I've also had one or two experiences under my belt. I've hiked 600 miles in the Appalachian Trail alone after high school, and my dad's an apocalypse prepper. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania where I'd hunt, and those are some of my not particularly impressive credentials. This is my attempt, not as an expert, but just as a guy who wants to give some advice on what I think might be useful. As with all my videos, and please just use this as a principle for the rest of your life, take the things I say with a grain of salt, since I'm not a wizard with magical powers that can give complete accuracy. And also, neither are the authorities that claim that. This video is going to take more stories and anecdotes from my personal life, since I'm going to be sharing how I am personally also trying to live through this crisis as it plays out. I hope that my personal experiences and anecdotes are useful for all of you who do live very different lives from me. I did, however, reach out to a professional apocalypse expert, Dawn Shift, who sells books on how to survive possible crises like social breakdowns or nuclear war. He's a big What If Altist fan, and I'd recommend checking out his stuff, and I have the links to his books in the description. He gave me a lot of advice for these videos. As I go through this video, I hope that this crisis, which may seem like a giant crashing tsunami, over time becomes more manageable, and you realize that you probably will survive, and that if you take precautions, you'll probably be even more fine than that. Dying in battle is one of the most heroic things a man can do, and now you can take part in some of the most intense battles in history, with Enlisted, a new kind of first-person shooter that combines elements of PvP and PvE in a very unique way. Enlisted lets you take control of a squad of customizable AI soldiers in campaigns from Moscow in 41 to Berlin in 45. These campaigns are so varied and different, it often feels like a different game, as you march across North Africa, or fight in the snows of Russia with an incredible array of period-accurate weapons, rifles, tanks, aircraft, and so much more. I love the sheer scope of this game. Every playthrough is different, and it really has a lot to offer. Playing as an American in Tunisia and a Russian in Berlin offer very different options, weapons, and challenges, which gives the game real replay value. I've really enjoyed Enlisted, and I'm sure you will as well, which is why I've partnered with Enlisted to give everyone who uses my link in the description a premium account featuring a bonus pack with multiple weapons and soldiers. Enlisted is free on PC, Xbox Series X, and PS5, so click the link and start your battle today. There's a role-playing game called The End of the World, in which you and your friends play yourself in situations like the zombie apocalypse, an alien invasion, or nuclear war. It's a lot of fun, and I highly recommend it. You construct the characters with their strengths and weaknesses based off you and your actual friends. It's really fun to rate your friends on what they suck at and roast them. However, the reason I bring this up is that there are 3 types of metrics in the game for separate ways to survive the apocalypse and skills you need, those being physical, social, and mental. I'm going to split this video into those 3 sections as well, or what you can do as an individual to survive the apocalypse in physical, social, and mental categories. Part 1, Physical. A major part of these sort of secular crises is a decline in standard of living. In Europe before the Black Death, the 17th century, or the French Revolution, the average person lived a terrible life, which is not coincidentally why those crises happened in the first place. We're seeing the exact same thing now. Someone in my staff said it in pretty apt terms, in which he said, over the last few years, it's not like there's been some major breaking point, we've just progressively gotten poorer over time, as your bank account gets lower and lower. A reason I bring this up now is that I feel like this is a pretty universal experience for almost everyone now, but people aren't really willing to talk about it, so I want you all to know that you're not alone. I'm personally doing fine, but I've seen my revenue from sponsors go down by around 1/3 over the last year, and basically every one of my friends is hassling to make ends meet now. The example I always like to bring up is that when The Simpsons was first made in the 80s, Homer Simpson was considered lower middle class, or working class, but he had 3 kids, a housewife, a house he owned, and could take multiple vacations a year without struggling financially. That sort of lifestyle is even out of reach for most upper middle class young people. I don't know any young people who are really in a position to have kids or start a family. Remember that even as late as 1970, the average couple had their first child at age 22, and in 1980, the average couple got married at age 24. Now most people at age 30 are unmarried. I don't think I need to tell you about any of these changes since we're all living through them. I really don't want to say this, but it's still true, is that things are going to get even worse from here. The economy now is good compared to where it'll be in 5 years, especially as it relates to standard of living. This is for a series of reasons which I have covered ad nauseum in previous videos, but this one describes it best. Basically, all the data lines up for a major social, political, and economic crisis over the next few years. I mean, also just look outside. Does it look like things are going to get any better, or are you seeing things deteriorate in real time? Part of this video is therapy for me, since I've seen everything get progressively worse in every vector of life every year. Whether how clean cities are, the mental health of people in my proximity, the quality of art, how much you can buy with $1, how much money you get, and about everything else. This is true for every single person I talk to. On top of that, are you seeing any opportunities or ideas that would allow us to get out of this crisis? Do you see any leaders who are forward-thinking or capable enough to find a way out, or are providing any real solutions, or any way for the political divide to heal? History is alive, and you can sometimes feel it happen in real time, and the feeling our modern political vibe gives off is like that of a person who's about to have a nervous breakdown or start screaming in pain, crying, or anything else, which finally lets out feelings that have been repressed for decades in our society. However, there's no way to get further without dealing with the issues that have been repressed in the underworld for decades or centuries. Across modern history, roughly every century, you see a period of breaking of the old order as the conclusions and worldview that had carried that society forward are no longer practicable, and now we are seeing the breakdown of the World War II era order. Let me explain what I believe the effects of this crisis will be upon people's material lives. The first is that inflation in the economy will get worse. Every single economic institution is antiquated now. The world's governments have just completed the largest money printing project ever in history, which always results in financial bubbles. Everything lines up for a financial and economic crisis. I don't know what form this might exactly take. However, it all results in the US dollar and the other currencies inflating to much larger degrees than where they are at now. The stock market is also incredibly overinflated compared to the rest of the economy and ought to have a reset. My personal investment strategy, although I am not an expert on this topic, and I assume there are people who know far more about this in the audience than I do, is based off things that always have to be supported by the government no matter what. I've invested in agriculture, mining, or military defense, since those are things where even if a currency becomes completely worthless, or the rest of the stock market fails, have to keep operating since the government needs people to get fed or have iron. In these earlier crises, you see the erasure of wealth in that income inequality, which reaches dazzling heights before the crisis, must collapse, and this occurs from both a combination of violent and peaceful means. For example, the US had the highest inequality up to that point in history in 1929, but then the Great Depression erased predominantly the wealth among the upper classes since they had more money to lose. Even though the poor did also suffer, well, the taxes in World War II also killed the rest of the income inequality, meaning America had the lowest inequality ever once it left World War II. In crises like this, the poor tend to suffer the most, but they come out of the crisis without as much lost status and wealth as the rich. In American history, we've seen alternating periods of high inequality and low inequality, or eras in which capital is more powerful versus wages. In our current era, we see wages are too low, and because of that, they were rising incredibly fast for the 5 years before COVID in the lowest level of wages, and with a labor shortage as well, as the highest capital inequality ever so far in American history. This has to balance out after the crisis with wages rising, thus meaning things will eventually get better in America after the crisis. This is one of the trends Turchin talks about and has been playing out for thousands of years, alternating periods of high and low inequality, and you just need to hold out until the end of this crisis, and then we'll probably be living in a golden age. One of the things I find interesting is that people look for stability in the wrong places. When I was in high school, people were working themselves to death trying to get good grades to get into a good college. I was really disaffected in high school, and I was kind of an edgelord, and I actually nearly failed school my freshman year of high school. However, people were all trying to get into the right school and job so they could be stable in a society with collapsing opportunities. However, I could intuitively realize the game was rigged, and even the people who thought they were winning weren't, and so I decided not to play. My father gave me one of the best pieces of advice ever at that point. He's an economic historian and told me that skills always pay off, and that if I got enough skills, I'd be paid for it. He also told me creativity and hard work are always a winning combination. I grinded hard on my YouTube channel, and now I'm by far the most successful person from my high school or college, even including those who ended up at Ivy Leagues, since the system is that broken. People abdicated their own judgment in order to get validation from a bureaucratic system, which used college degrees as a proxy for actual capability, but that validation was a lie the whole time, and so the whole system fell apart. One of my good friends had 2 degrees from Harvard, and she still felt loss because her family had designed her life to get that Harvard degree, but she had no idea how to use it after. And that's the big problem of a bureaucratic-minded society. My advice is just to get skills. One of my favorite facts is that the best way to not get drafted into a major war is to be a technician who can fix cars, computers, or radios. This is since these skills are valuable and relatively rare, so if you have them, you're too valuable for your social superiors to let you die on the battlefield. There's an even more interesting fact that in a failed state, the safest place to be is the military, since your warlord will always make sure you're fed and have medical care. 80% of the deaths in war are civilians. In the age of the internet, it's very easy to learn skills for free, and there's not really an excuse for not doing so. I went to college for a semester, and everything else I've picked up from random books or the internet. Now I do history professionally and have a large audience that supports myself and my staff. In an age of chaos, in which, for example, the universities have become ideological indoctrination camps, people are looking for new things that can work, since none of the institutions do, and so they'll end up looking for raw talent and skill. Once I learned history by self-study in order to manage this YouTube channel, I also had to figure out writing, narration, video production, and business management to at least some bare-bones degree. Once I developed a network of people from my YouTube channel, I could also improve my social skills, travel, and learn more about how the world works, thus allowing myself to develop as an adult. Skills and life experiences beget more skills and life experiences. Most of you don't have large social networks that are constantly sucking up your time, so nothing is preventing you from learning French, carpentry, or business from the internet or books. Then you can join digital communities where you can talk about those things and further hone your craft. One of my friends said, in current America, the only thing that works is that when you buy a car, you know it'll drive. The universities and media have become raw propaganda. The courts have become biased towards the rich and women. The economic system only works for the rich. Diversity quotas have ruined hiring for white men. Dating and social life is completely broken. Congress doesn't pass any laws. Most people are alienated atheists, thus religion has failed. Housing is too expensive, and you could go on for another 20 things. All of these institutions are broken and run by delusional boomers who don't even want to understand the underlying problems. Thus meaning if you want to win, try to jump on board of what could possibly replace the old rotting institutions. If you choose right, you can end up as part of the new ruling class for the rest of your life. Where there is chaos, look for opportunity. Look at an institution that you think is failing and try to figure out what could replace it. You can look to the mighty nobleman Napoleon, who came from the backwater Corsica, who through his own talents rose to become the emperor of Europe. Alternately, the teenage peasant Joan of Arc or the Georgian peasant Stalin, all of whom rose to power during a secular cycle. And all those societies were going through secular cycles in which the old elite had been invalidated, so they were looking for people who had new ideas. And on a more micro scale, try to see what's not working in society, then figure out what might replace it, then get with that thing. If you think, for example, mainstream media is on decline, try to find some way to get into the world of alternative media. Or people like Tim Pool or the Young Turks might replace traditional news stations. If you're not optimistic with the public school system, try to get in on the charter school system. Most people will hire you if you're willing to not be well paid. And so if you get into an industry that you think has a lot of growth potential, try to do so. I would say, just as a tip for both staying alive during the crisis and afterwards, stop playing games that you're doomed to lose. In Orson Scott Card's book Ender's Game, there is this game that young Ender has to play, and then the ultimate point in the game is the realization that no matter what you do, you lose, so break the game. If everyone is trying blank and they're all failing, stop trying that game and go for something where you as an individual have a positional advantage, whether through natural talent or being in a lucky place. If you know you're doomed in dating due to the current conditions, stop trying to play that game and work out instead, which whether or not it will make you more attractive, it puts you in a better position while also teaching you skills and discipline. If you're in a town where the rent just keeps going up every year, so much so that it's trapping you in poverty, research a part of the country or town where life is cheaper and move there. One of the things I always try to aim for is strategic flexibility, and this is one of Sun Tzu's top points in The Art of War. In chess, don't make plans that are dependent upon other people's actions. Instead, have strategies that can work under a multiplicity of circumstances. Charisma, intelligence, and charm, for example, are skills that are always useful to cultivate for any endeavor. However, even if you do everything, there are still many factors outside of your control. Life's just gonna get harder, and there's lots of things that just happen. Large parts of the world, for example, including significant parts of Asia and Africa, will see famines, and it's not a judgment on your character whether you happen to end up in an unlucky area of the world. If you can move to another region where you'll be closer to food production, that might be a good idea. We don't know how much supply trains will break down, but we know it'll happen to a certain extent. If you live in an area that can sustain itself with its own food, you're not going to have real problems. If anything, the price of food's going to go down. For a bunch of reasons, including lack of riots, crime, angry neighbors, and easier food supplies, rural areas are significantly safer than cities. As the standard of living gets worse, humans will be your main worry, while deers and squirrels are just potential food. If things are really bad, just get out of the way. When humans go crazy, it's like a hurricane where you should just try to get out. If you're in a country like Egypt and Iraq where food supplies might get nasty, I would just go out into some uninhabited part of the desert, bring a couple months worth of food and water if you can, and then wait for things to calm down in the main population centers. Also, an obvious answer is stockpiling. If you're worried about being able to get certain things in the future, buy up a reserve in advance if you can. If you do it really well, you can sell it at elevated prices later. My father's kind of a prepper, and he'd always keep 2 months of food in iodine tablets to process water where I grew up in rural PA. Get food that can store well, like pastas or cans. Basic medicine as well can be vital, even if you just resell it for elevated prices later. Don Shift told me that the things that will get you through basically any apocalypse or bad situation is a stockpile of food. In a lightly populated area, while being armed and fortified. Most criminals tend to be cowards who prey on the weak, and so if you're not an easy target, the chances that they pass over you are pretty high. Keep in mind, almost no one prepares for this sort of thing, so even the basics, puts you ahead of 99% of people. If you have even the smallest amount of weapons training, that's better than 95% of the population. I don't know if we'll have major disease outbreaks in the coming crisis. It's totally within possibility. But if we do, this same advice holds. For example, the nobility had significantly lower death rates during the Black Plague because they would retreat into the countryside and isolate themselves, while the peasants didn't have that opportunity. So everything else still holds. In order to protect your possessions, you should get some kind of weapon. Get the best weapon you can get your hands on. If you're in most countries where it's difficult to own firearms, at least get an axe. The good news is people probably won't pull a gun on you, and so you won't be outgunned, so to speak. Part 2, mental. Hiking the Appalachian Trail was interesting for a couple reasons, but one of them was to see how it changes people. Everyone who's been on the trail long enough will see it imprint itself on their character in some way. It was crazy to see people who you would easily consider to be basic sorority girls or bros over time turn into kind of hard badasses. I remember clawing my toenail off with a Swiss Army knife, having to burn a leech off my hand with fire, worrying about rattlesnakes, getting close with 1,000-pound bears 4 or 5 times, living through rainy nights where the inside of my tent became a pond, or hiking 12 hours in the rain. When you return to normal life, it changes your perspective on the rest of it. One of the things people who have experienced war talk about is how it changes people, to a much greater degree than what I talk about in the Appalachian Trail. A nice boy you can imagine grabbing lunch with in high school, once he's plopped in a war zone, can kill babies and do so many more unspeakable things. At the same time, another thing veterans talk about is how hard it is to really kill people and how strong the will to life is well tested. People are like cockroaches in some ways. It's crazy to hear about a city being besieged and starved for months or years over history, and people find ways to survive. Alternately, how in World War I an army could drop days upon days and ton upon ton of shells onto a single battlefield, but in most cases the soldiers dug into trenches found a way to survive. The way I'm going to summarize this point is that the person you are today is not the real you. For most people, it's a socially constructed veneer, but once you're under pressure, the real version of you will come out. For some people, that person is kind, brave, and tough beyond what they could have possibly imagined. For others, that person is more petty, cruel, and manipulative than they ever could have imagined. One of my personal pet peeves about language is that people will just passively say, oh yeah, he's a nice guy, and I don't like that because most people are not good. Most people are passively nice because being agreeable gets them stuff, and they're not in any real position of power testing. But most people, if you test them against either the will of the group or put them in a position of authority, will be corrupted, and they won't do the right thing. And in our society, we need to glorify the people who, under pressure, did the right thing, rather than just the very passive sense of kindness that we have today. The old Swiss psychologist Carl Jung talks about this idea of the shadow, or that when you put people under pressure, you see the opposite traits of what they normally manifest, which were repressed the whole time. Your ability to love and integrate your shadow in a healthy way determines your strength. For me, for example, my strongest function in Jungian terms is the magician or the hermit, which is why I love reading books and studying these topics, and my shadow is the explorer, which is why I love traveling or going on crazy adventures and that stuff. So my ability to get with my explorer side that's the opposite of my hermit intellectual side makes me a healthier person. It's kind of been heartbreaking for me to see how people in my life have dealt with hardship. Most of the time, it's much worse than you would imagine. It's really sad to see people I loved or trusted descend into radical ideologies that act as mind viruses, become wholly centered on materialism, cutting out their friends, or becoming so depressed as to not function. As life's gotten harder, it's really sad to see how few people are actually who they said they were or pretending to be before. It's a blessing in some ways because you realize the friends you do make in the hard times are the actually good ones that you can rely on. Jordan Peterson likes to say there's 4 ways you can deal with the pain of life. The first is consuming yourself in pleasure to forget it. The second is subsuming yourself into an ideology that does all the thinking for you. And the third is to descend into nihilism, which eventually leads to being a school shooter or self-deleting. The correct way is to take responsibility for your own life and decisions, which is the road to heroism. Watch yourself to see that you're not descending into any of the 3 other negative strategies. Your identity can't be built around titles and material possessions. These are things that go very easily. I remember when I was a child, the American system promised people my age a middle class life, marriage, and material goods only if they worked hard. None of that was true, and since our society has become so materialistic, it helped cause the massive mental health crisis since people had no way to assess themselves except through material success, but they failed at that game. In Eastern religions like Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism, they say the only thing you can rely on is change. To be too focused upon the material existence that exists around us will only leave you weak if it falls apart. I moved 13 times before I turned age 15, and I didn't change schools that much, but I still did do it a lot. And what I found is that if I stayed myself while going to a new school, I would be able to attract people like my friends in the old school I went to. The mindset of building your identity around your soul rather than the things around you will keep you alive in the worst conditions. I meditate a lot and I try to know myself as a way of building a relationship with myself as a person, which allows a greater degree of awareness and self-control. One of the most fascinating things you learn is that the soul and the inner character has great depth that you can draw large amounts of strength from. As I meditate, I've developed kind of different mental areas of my subconscious that I go to that allow me to basically get in a different mindset. Some, like I'll imagine a garden, I'll imagine a beautiful hall, and then as I meditate in that, it gives me a different degree of mental clarity. And I'm really into mysticism, and I've gone on shamanic spirit quests, and I think developing a relationship with the divine is one of the most important things you can do to live through hard times, because it gives you a degree of depth to your character that allows you to pull upon inner strength more easily. Over time, you learn that you are a stranger to yourself. Don't blame yourself for failures outside of your control. If you're trying your hardest, that's all you can do. But taking blame for things outside your control only prevents you from doing the things inside your control. I understand that this is incredibly hard and sometimes feels impossible with the human condition, but it's something to aim for. Your negative feelings of anger, pain, impotence, and more are normal human reactions to terrible circumstances. You're not crazy, the world around you is. To continue on this point, use history and your ancestors as a benchmark for what is correct. Most people follow the mob and are carried away by its insanity in that moment. However, I would recommend thinking, would my parents, grandparents, or even my ancestors 100 or 200 years ago approve of what I'm doing? Alternately, whatever role models you use like Jesus, Buddha, George Washington, Charlemagne, Pepe, and think if they were here, would they approve of what I am doing? The human mind is naturally self-serving and manipulative, so it's easy to warp any mental technique if it's used in bad faith. But I can't imagine any other generation of Americans would be okay with people trying to end free speech, having a tyranny of tolerance, or our current degree of polarization, and so I'm making a stand on those issues. Growing up with my mom, who suffers multiple mental illnesses, I use techniques like this to basically stay sane in a crazy environment. As the world grows more crazy, you can't use its standards to judge itself. Try to insulate yourself from the hurricane that is public discourse and root yourself in that which is timeless. For this reason, I've really stopped using social media or watching new pop culture, since it's all part of the insanity that is modern culture. Instead, I'm moving to the countryside and mostly entertain myself through reading, watching old movies, or talking to friends. The world outside can be crazy, but you can try to insulate as much of your personal life from it as possible. In some ways, I've lived a privileged life, and in others, I've lived a rough life. By the time I turned age 16, I didn't have the will to live, and the thing that pulled me out of it was my dad, although our relationship hasn't been perfect. Always told me growing up that the only thing that mattered in life was honor. And even if I lived a failing life, but still had honor, it would be worth it. That idea, even at my worst point of life, gave me the reason to keep living. After that, I was able to pull my life back together. If you have something that you can believe in beyond yourself, that is the greatest protection against nihilism. I've suffered PTSD, which is a horrible illness, since it means your biological fight or flight system's always on, thus making it difficult to sleep, maintain relationships, concentrate, or do daily tasks. At a lot of points, it feels like a dark, numbing, stabbing pain that consumes your whole body. I've been in trauma therapy for a year and a half, and I'm much better off than I used to be. The thing that's always kept me going through the worst points is that unwavering faith that comes from that rock, or the idea that if what I've done is right, my life will be worth living. In the worst times, you just can't afford to think. In high-pressure situations, it's the same as well, in that you need to make a decision, and you can't afford to take time to weigh different variables. Thinking merely becomes a series of justifications telling you why your pain is too bad to keep going with. You need to know that the real answer, no matter what your mind or body is telling you in that moment, is that you need to survive. Bad times and depression act like drugs that warp our minds, but you need to be able to stay in touch at least with how you think during the good times. This is why having external standards you can use to judge your conduct is so important. For the final part of the mental category, always try to be in touch with useful and important information that can help you. Try to avoid junk. Most of the stuff we get fed today is highly emotional propaganda that is designed to deceive you. The kind of information that is useful for your survival varies upon what the details of your life is, but try to keep in touch with that useful information and filter out the stuff that makes you angrier. Part 3. Social. We often forget how social life is one of the most important pillars of life, but in our atomized age, people don't look at the social or community level at all. Right now and through this crisis, we've seen the breakdown of social communities. The largest chunk of Americans has literally no friends. 2/3 of young men are single, the average woman at age 30 is childless. I talk about this in my dating video, but the most broken aspect of our society, barring possibly religion, is social connections. I don't know how else to say this, but most of us will have to accept being lonely for the near future. Almost every person I know is lonely. Even ones whose jobs are networking will confide in me that they feel lonely. The modern world may have critical mass relationships, or you talk to lots of people in some jobs, but most of these relationships are very transactional and shallow, giving very little depth or satisfaction. There's this term in the incel world called the black pill, or taking the pill that you will be lonely and sexless for your whole life. I don't like that term since most of the people watching this show are pretty young and have long lives ahead of them, so things have to work out at some point, since we as humans have social needs that really need to be met, but aren't so since society will subconsciously evolve to meet them. However, our society is so socially broken that we should develop ways of shoring up in the meantime. One of my favorite movies is Ben-Hur, which is a movie made in the 50s about a Jewish prince who is sold into slavery in the Roman Empire. And over time, he rises to wealth, freedom, and gets revenge on the men who betrayed him, while becoming spiritually enlightened through meeting Christ. The thing with the black pill is it's basically Ben-Hur being stuck in slavery forever and reconciling himself to that fate forever. The sad part of this is Don Shifts told me that the number one thing that will let you survive a major crisis in the future is a strong network, where if you get sick or you have trouble finding work or any other problem, if you have a large network of family and friends, that's the top thing that will help you. And not coincidentally, the factors that help you as an individual survive in this crisis are that which traditional societies pushed, such as strong family, being self-sufficient, being well-armed, etc. And if you can cultivate a large social network of people supporting you, that is one of the best strategies you could do. When you can cultivate friend networks, try to find those who are good for you and share your values. I've built a social network through What If Autist fans, which is great since we all have shared interests, values, and goals. I would love to see content creators do stuff that would allow their fans to meet each other more easily, but that's not something that's well marketed or designed now. Try to find friends who will support you for who you really are. You don't have to put up a front for. Friends who you have to front for who don't really support your best interests in mind are worse than having no friends. They can be drinking buddies, but nothing more. They also gradually break down who you are, diluting you with the corruption of the age. In the chaos of the coming crisis, people will be able to coordinate more easily with those with shared values and worldview. I don't know what works for you, whether church, sports club, school, whatever. Just try to make sure you have enough social interactions to not go crazy. One of the most important things is that people who don't have enough social interactions will get into these vindictive spirals that just make them lonelier. They start to resent the society that they feel rejected by. They start to dress worse, they start to act angry at the people around them, isolate themselves, and more. This is one of the most dangerous things to do today. The chaos of our times hurts different demographics in separate ways. Young women are objectively the demographic that has the worst mental health today. They've really been screwed over by a combination of social media, body standards, and the breakdown of social communities. Feminism also says everything they do is empowering, which also means they don't have any standards of conduct, which is maddening in that it means they end up projecting all their problems onto men and are incapable of thinking about the actual problems they have as women, since that's what the dominant ideology tells them to do. Have empathy with young women, but also understand they're going through the equivalent of a psychological pandemic. I do not know a single girl under the age of 25 without a bad mental health problem. Young men have been vilified by society as evil, with society dismantling every healthy outlet for masculinity. The dating market, in which the vast majority of young men are unmarried and sexually frustrated, will also create a different psychological pandemic among young men rather than women. Over the next few decades, expect young male culture to become incredibly aggressive as they burn the village that won't let them in to feel its warmth. A lot of the elderly have been completely disconnected from these issues. They're often stuck in time capsules in which they can pretend none of these problems are happening. They're also incentivized to believe the previous system's good since they created it. You should not expect empathy from them. A crazy statistic is that in this last year, 44% of home purchases were by baby boomers, the youngest of which are in their 60s. Gen Z, the oldest of whom are nearly 30, and should be the demographic buying the most houses in a healthy society, was such a small percentage as to barely register. For whatever reason, the demographic that seems most isolated from these mental contagions is middle-aged men. I have like 4 friends who are in their early 60s or late 50s that actually do understand the crises going on, often since they have kids who are directly facing it, but they're also removed from the hysteria you see among the young, who are freaking out at how screwed they are. In times like this, mental health crises become pandemics that consume the whole society. Expect your average person to be some degree of crazy. And I need to make a video about this, but I could diagnose modern society with 5 major mental illnesses. The thing that worries me is that since social life is so broken today, that I'm scared that the way society will reintegrate is basically through weird cults that control individual behavior. People get around problems of group cooperation through religion or ideology. This is a double-edged sword where you can partly see good religions like Christianity or Buddhism, or evil religions like Nazism or the Soviet communism. The short answer I'd say is that if you see a good movement, join it and try to get on their side, and if you see a bad movement, try to oppose it if you can. In the coming crisis, if you see radicals taking over your area, leave before they can hurt you. Part of the reason I left Los Angeles and moved to Texas is I'm worried if the system gets worse, you could see horrible crime, gangs, and riots in California. The LAPD won't protect property or lives if things get really bad due to the whole defund the police movement. I also worry about California, which has already started to do plans for reparations, which is funny since they never practiced African slavery, and they're currently trying to ban tobacco. Thus, if things get worse, what else are they going to do? Also, I'm a Canadian citizen and I left Canada before they started having their insane COVID lockdowns and limits on free speech. This stuff sounds crazy, but we'll see governments become more authoritarian around the world, whether in China, the Netherlands, Iran, New York, or anywhere else. Leave when you can. If totalitarians do see control of your area, I would just lie low. If you want to be a martyr for freedom, go ahead. But I think we need cool-headed people alive in case the totalitarians lose power. If you can, try to build networks of like-minded people where you can talk about your dissenting views in secrecy, and maybe plot a resistance. All of my experiences are a much more muted version of this. However, I went to a high school and college that were insanely progressive. My high school, the year I left, replaced Study of Foreign Culture Week with Social Justice Week. And my college was trying to make critical race theory mandatory. It was a society where you'd be outcasted and possibly even reprimanded by the administration for making a centrist, let alone conservative, opinion. What I've found is that the most radicals, barring the most paranoid, like Stalin or Nero, don't actually think about the things they say. They use jargon to get around actually having to think about the topics involved, since fanaticism exists to abdicate responsibility to the group. I would make contrarian arguments, but through the language of social justice, and it actually worked. I would say stuff like, the best way to push transgender norms is through co-opting traditional gender norms and strengthening them, how overemphasizing the role of European colonialism on native societies was racist, and how women should be empowered to decide to stay in the home, and expecting women to work was covert patriarchy, all of which worked. Alternately, in my high school, they had a protest where you could walk out of class if you were against people owning assault rifles. However, the Second Amendment is one of the things I care the most about. When people asked me why I was one of the very few people who didn't join the group, I said I felt such deep emotional turmoil, and my emotional register was just so much that I couldn't bear to go to the protest. Leftist radicals also tend to consume their own inner factions and target outsiders to a much lesser degree. If you keep your head down, attend the meetings, mouth the right words, but not say anything too clever, they'll ignore you. Radicals are incapable of seeing anything outside of their mental prism, and that's their big blind side. There's an old Irish song that translates from Gaelic, "If it's not your business, why do you care?" This is the summary of my mindset for this crisis. And as society is going insane, in some ways you can try to figure out how to make it. First of all, stop needing validation from the society itself, since it has gone insane. Build an internal life that's not dependent upon the society's current silliness, and try to build relationships around that. For your own personal career success, try to figure out what vectors the society is failing at, and get skills to fill the right niches. If you get it right, you can end up in the next society's ruling class. Most of all, hold yourself to standards that exist out of your current era of history. Don't forget what your heroes or ancestors who lived in more sane times would tell you is right. Know that as long as you act with honor, even if you die, you are on the right side of history. Thank you to Enlisted for sponsoring this video. Try their epic World War II battle simulator where you can try with an incredible amount of different weapons in different theaters of war for lots of incredible gameplay experiences. Start playing Enlisted today. What a faultist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my Instagram, Twitter, or my Patreon that has the first 400 pages of my history of the world, as well as the first 250 of my history of America. As always, thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.